This is a historical narration, not a record of exact dates, but a story about how systems quietly formed, and why we still live inside them. For most of human existence, movement was normal. People followed resources rather than plans. They adapted to seasons instead of schedules. They left when conditions demanded it, without ceremony or hesitation. Staying in one place was not the default. It was a risk. Nothing encouraged permanence. Nothing required consistency. Life unfolded through immediate need rather than long-term design. Survival depended on awareness, not structure. This story begins before societies had formal systems, before behavior was shaped by rules that lasted, and before order could exist beyond the moment it was enforced. It begins in a world where survival came first, where memory lived in people rather than institutions, and where organization had not yet learned how to stay. Before structure became invisible and before authority felt natural, human life existed in motion. For most of human existence, life had no fixed shape. People moved when food sources shifted and when environmental conditions demanded it. They gathered when cooperation increased their chances of survival, and they separated when a scarcity or conflict made closeness dangerous. Human groups expanded and contracted naturally without formal boundaries or permanent centers. There were no permanent settlements. Shelter was temporary, adapted to seasons and necessity. A place that served one generation might be abandoned by the next without ceremony or regret. Space was not owned, it was used. There were no fixed social roles in the way we understand them now. Individuals contributed based on ability, age, experience, and circumstance. Leadership emerged situationally. Someone who guided a hunt did not automatically guide conflict resolution. Someone trusted for knowledge was not obeyed in all matters. Authority was fluid. It existed only as long as it was useful. When circumstances changed, authority shifted with them. Knowledge passed through observation, repetition, and memory. Skills were learned by watching others perform them. There were no formal teachers, only participants. There were no written records to preserve decisions or define norms. Everything relied on shared understanding and immediate recognition. Disputes were resolved through proximity. If conflict arose, it had to be addressed directly. Consequences were immediate and personal. There was no higher system to appeal to, no institution to mediate on behalf of absent rules. Resolution depended on the relationships involved and the willingness of the group to continue functioning together. Life was unstable, but it was flexible. Adaptation mattered more than control. Survival favored those who could adjust rather than those who could dominate. Mistakes carried consequences, but they were not preserved beyond the moment unless memory held them. What we now call society existed, but it had not yet been organized. It was reactive rather than planned. Patterns emerged naturally, but they were not enforced. Everything depended on presence, on being seen, on being recognized, on contributing enough to remain part of the group. Nothing was guaranteed to exist tomorrow. Not leadership, not shelter, not even the group itself. As populations slowly increased, flexibility became fragile. More people meant more competition for the same resources. Areas that once supported small groups now had to accommodate larger gatherings for longer periods of time. Movement slowed. Temporary camps lasted longer. Shared spaces became crowded. With crowding came friction. Disputes that were once rare became common. Small disagreements carried larger consequences when people could not easily separate and move away. Memory alone was no longer enough to manage repeated interactions. Trust became selective. Relationships became more complex. Temporary solutions began to fail. Patterns that worked for small groups could not scale. Informal agreements broke down under repetition. People remembered past conflicts differently. Expectations clashed. What once felt manageable began to feel exhausting. Certain places were reused again and again. Water sources, hunting grounds, seasonal gathering areas became familiar and contested. These places began to matter, not just for survival, but for continuity. Certain individuals were consulted repeatedly, not because they held authority, but because their judgment reduced conflict. Over time, patterns of consultation formed. Influence emerged quietly. Pressure did not arrive as an idea. No one decided that life needed structure. Pressure arrived as fatigue, as conflict, as the growing difficulty of managing shared existence without repetition and predictability. Life required coordination, and coordination required agreement. What had once supported freedom now demanded limits. What had once allowed improvisation now required expectation. The very conditions that made human cooperation successful began to strain under their own success. Structure was not chosen because it was desirable. It became necessary because flexibility could no longer carry the weight of scale. Organization did not arrive suddenly. It formed through repetition. People returned to the same locations because familiarity reduced uncertainty. Tasks were divided informally because efficiency mattered. Roles stabilized not because they were assigned, but because repetition reinforced them. Someone who coordinated movement once did it again. Someone who mediated disputes was consulted more often. Expectations formed quietly, without declaration. Boundaries appeared before they were built. Space began to feel defined even without markers. Time was marked before it was measured. Events began to happen in expected sequences. Organization allowed survival to scale. It reduced conflict by narrowing choices. It preserved memory by embedding it in behavior rather than relying on recall alone. Life no longer reset each day. Decisions carried forward. Actions had continuity. The past began to matter in new ways. With organization came predictability. With predictability came planning. And with planning came permanence. People could now imagine futures that extended beyond immediate survival. They could prepare rather than react. They could coordinate efforts across time rather than only in the present moment. Organization did not eliminate uncertainty, but it contained it. It transformed chaos into something manageable. It gave shape to human behavior. The world was beginning to hold its shape. This shape was not designed, it was accumulated. Once organization stabilized life, authority followed. Decisions needed consistency, rules needed enforcement, memory needed protection from distortion and conflict. Organization alone was not enough to sustain itself. Authority did not begin as control. It began as trust extended repeatedly. Certain voices carried more weight because their decisions reduced harm. Certain actions carried consequences because consistency mattered more than flexibility. Over time, influence hardened into expectation. Authority created order, it also created limits. Choice narrowed. Deviation became costly. Behavior was shaped not just by survival, but by acceptance. Compliance reduced conflict. Predictability became valuable. For the first time, order existed beyond the moment. It did not dissolve when individuals left or circumstances changed. It remained. and once authority took hold, it rarely released its grip. Structure became normal, compliance became expectation. What was once negotiated became enforced. Human life was no longer shaped only by immediate need. It was managed through rules, norms, and consequences that extended beyond personal relationships. Authority did not replace human judgment, it reorganized it. The system had begun to govern behavior even when no one was watching. Over time, structure stops feeling like something people do and starts feeling like something life simply is. Rules that were once negotiated become rules that are assumed. The reason they exist becomes less important than the fact that they exist. People no longer remember the uncertainty those rules were meant to reduce. They only remember that life feels safer when everyone follows the same expectations. This is the moment when structure becomes culture. Culture is not only art or language, it is the set of behaviors that a group treats as normal. It is what people do without explaining it. It is what children learn before they are old enough to question it. And once structure becomes culture, it begins to reproduce itself. In the beginning, rules are often practical. They reduce conflict, they protect resources. They set boundaries that make cooperation possible. But over time, rules become more than tools. They become signals. They tell people who belongs, who understands, and who is trustworthy. A person who follows the rules is treated as predictable. Predictability becomes a form of safety. A person who breaks the rules introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty becomes a threat. Even if the rule itself is not sacred, the stability it represents becomes sacred. This is why systems tend to expand once they form. A system rarely stays small. Once a group has learned the value of predictability, it begins to apply it everywhere. If rules work for one part of life, the temptation is to bring rules to the rest of life. If consistency reduces conflict in one area, the assumption becomes that consistency will reduce conflict everywhere, and gradually the system reaches into more of daily behavior, not because someone declared it should, but because people adapt to what feels stable. Structure also creates roles, and roles create identity. At first, roles are simply repeated tasks. Someone often repairs, someone often mediates, someone often organizes. But repetition turns into expectation. Expectation turns into responsibility. Responsibility turns into status. Status turns into hierarchy. And hierarchy begins to feel natural, even when it was once flexible. People begin to describe themselves through the structure. They belong not only to a group of people, but to a way of life. They become defined by how they fit into the system, by their duties, their permissions, their obligations, and their place. And once identity is tied to structure, people begin to defend structure emotionally, not only practically. A rule is no longer just a rule, it becomes a sign of who we are. This is where tradition forms. Tradition is often the memory of a system. It preserves behaviors long after the original reasons fade. Something that began as a practical choice becomes a sacred habit. Not because the habit is perfect, but because it is familiar. Familiarity becomes comfort. Comfort becomes meaning. The next generation inherits the system already built. They do not experience its formation, they experience its presence. They are taught where to stand, when to speak, what is permitted, what is forbidden, what is respected, what is shameful. And because they learn these things early, they absorb them as reality. This is one of the most important shifts in human history. When systems stop being constructed and start being inherited. Once inheritance begins, change becomes difficult. To change a system is not only to change a rule, it is to change the identity built around that rule. It is to challenge the comfort that stability provides. It is to reopen uncertainty. Even if people recognize that a system is imperfect, they may still prefer it to the fear of disorder. So the system protects itself. Sometimes it protects itself through enforcement, but often it protects itself through culture, through expectations, approval, disapproval, praise, and exclusion. The threat of being treated as an outsider becomes a powerful force. People follow rules not only to avoid punishment, but to avoid separation. And slowly, structure becomes invisible, not because it disappears, but because it becomes the background of life. People stop noticing it the same way they stop noticing air. It shapes behavior without constant attention. It influences choices without being named. This is the point when authority no longer needs to speak loudly. When culture locks in, compliance happens automatically. People enforce the system on each other through daily interactions. They teach it, repeat it, and pass it down without needing to understand the origins. The system outlives its creators. The people who first adapted to pressure are gone. The ones who negotiated early rules are gone. The ones who built the first forms of authority are gone. But the structure remains, because it has become culture. And when structure becomes culture, it gains a kind of permanence. It becomes the default. It becomes the standard. It becomes the world people believe they have always lived in. What began as survival hardens into tradition. What began as coordination becomes identity. What began as a solution becomes a reality. This is how systems learn to stay. Modern life feels structured because it is. Schedules, laws, borders, institutions all trace back to this moment. The moment when survival required order, when freedom narrowed, when systems replaced improvisation. We do not live outside these systems, we were raised inside them. And once systems form, they rarely disappear. They evolve, they expand, they become invisible. This was not the beginning of history. It was the beginning of the world we recognized. This was not the end of a moment. It was the beginning of a system. And once systems form, they rarely disappear.